I never thought I'd share this story. Partly because I still have nightmares about that night, and partly because it feels like some stories are better left untold. But here I am, compelled to recount the most harrowing experience of my life. Maybe it's a warning or perhaps a way for me to finally let go. Either way, I hope you're ready, because this isn't just another ghost story. This one. It's personal. It all began when I decided to move back to my childhood home after years of being away. My mother had passed a few months earlier, and the house stood eerily vacant. The memories of my upbringing were tucked into its walls, but so were the whispers of something darker. The house was a two-story Victorian-style relic, perched at the end of an overgrown cul-de-sac. I remember it vividly, peeling paint on the shutters, a crooked weather vane atop the roof, and a single door at the end of the second-floor hallway that my parents always told me to ignore. They didn't give me an explanation, just that it was locked for a reason and wasn't meant to be opened. As a child, I obeyed without question. As an adult, curiosity began to nag at me. When I arrived, the house felt different. Not just in the way that time wears down familiar places, but as though the air itself was heavy, dense with an energy I couldn't explain. My footsteps echoed in the emptiness as I brought my things inside. Shadows stretched long in the fading light, but it wasn't until the sun dipped below the horizon that the house seemed to come alive. That night, as I was settling into my old bedroom, I heard it, the sound of something scratching. Faint at first, almost like a mouse trapped inside the walls. I ignored it, convincing myself it was nothing. But then it grew louder, more deliberate, and seemed to be coming from the direction of that door. I told myself it was my imagination, but deep down, I knew better. I tried to distract myself, unpacking boxes and setting up my room. Yet the scratching continued, relentless. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. Armed with a flashlight, I crept down the hallway, the old floorboards creaking under my weight. When I reached the door, I froze. My heart pounded in my chest, and every instinct screamed at me to turn back. But instead, I placed my hand on the doorknob. It was ice cold. I tried to twist it, but it wouldn't budge. Locked, just as it had always been. Relieved, I let out a shaky breath and started to turn away. That's when I heard it, whispering. The voice was low, unintelligible, but undeniably there. It wasn't my imagination. I backed away slowly, never taking my eyes off the door. The whispers grew louder, more insistent, until they suddenly stopped. The silence was deafening. Then, the knob turned. I bolted back to my room and locked the door, my mind racing. I stayed up the rest of the night, too afraid to sleep. Every creak of the house, every distant sound, set my nerves on edge. By morning, I was exhausted but determined to figure out what was going on. The next day, I called an old friend who had grown up with me in the neighborhood. His name was Kevin, and he was always the adventurous one. When I told him about the door, he went quiet for a moment before saying, "You need to leave that house." "What are you talking about?" I asked, though I already knew his answer wouldn't bring me any comfort. "You don't remember? The stories? Everyone in the neighborhood knew about that door. There's a reason it's locked." I pressed him for details, and what he told me sent chills down my spine. Decades ago, a man named Samuel lived in the house. He was a recluse, known for his strange experiments and late-night rituals. One night, neighbors reported hearing terrifying screams coming from the house. When authorities arrived, they found Samuel dead, his body twisted and contorted in unnatural ways. The room behind the door was where it had happened. "Whatever he summoned," Kevin said, "is still there." I laughed nervously, brushing off his words. "Come on, Kevin. You don't actually believe that, do you?" "I don't know what I believe," he admitted. "But I know that door's been sealed ever since. For good reason." That night, I couldn't stop thinking about what Kevin had said. My logical mind wanted to dismiss it as an urban legend, but deep down, I felt the truth in his words. As I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I heard it again, the scratching. This time, it was more violent, like claws raking against wood. I grabbed the flashlight and made my way down the hallway. The door was rattling on its hinges, as though something was trying to get out. My pulse quickened, and I found myself reaching for the doorknob again, against my better judgment. Before I could touch it, a loud bang echoed through the house, and I jumped back. The door went still, the scratching and whispers replaced by an oppressive silence. Then, slowly, the knob began to turn again. This time, I didn't wait to see what would happen. I ran back to my room, slammed the door shut, and called Kevin. "You need to come over," I pleaded. "What?" Why? Because I'm not staying here alone. Reluctantly, he agreed. When he arrived, I told him everything that had happened. He was skeptical but agreed to stay the night. We both sat in the living room, armed with flashlights and a baseball bat he had brought. Hours passed, and nothing happened. I started to feel foolish, like maybe I had imagined it all. But just as I was about to suggest we call it a night, the scratching started again. Kevin's eyes widened as he heard it too. Okay, he said, his voice shaky. Maybe you're not crazy after all. We both crept down the hallway, the sound growing louder with each step. When we reached the door, it was rattling violently. Kevin looked at me, then back at the door. What do we do? He whispered. I don't know, I admitted. Before we could decide, the door stopped moving. The silence was so sudden it felt unnatural. Then, without warning, the door burst open. The door swung open with such force that the frame splintered, sending fragments of wood scattering across the hallway. Kevin and I staggered back, our flashlights trembling in our hands. Beyond the doorway was darkness, complete and suffocating. It wasn't just the absence of light, it felt like a void, a blackness that seemed alive. I wanted to turn and run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. Kevin, clutching the baseball bat tightly, whispered, "What the hell is that?" The scratching started again, but this time, it came from inside the room. Then the whispering began, low, guttural voices speaking in a language I couldn't understand. It sounded like a chorus of agony, and it grew louder with each passing second. "Close it," Kevin yelled, snapping me out of my trance. I reached for the door, but as my hand neared it, the whisper stopped abruptly. In the deafening silence that followed, a cold breeze rushed out from the room, carrying with it the faint stench of decay. Something moved in the shadows. Kevin shone his flashlight into the darkness, and for a brief moment, we saw it, a figure hunched and twisted, its limbs unnaturally long, its face obscured. Its eyes, or what should have been eyes, were empty sockets that seemed to suck in the light. It took a step forward, and we both stumbled back, screaming. Kevin swung the bat wildly, hitting the door frame, but the figure didn't flinch. Instead, it tilted its head, as if studying us. I grabbed Kevin's arm. "We need to go. Now." We turned and ran, the sound of the door slamming shut behind us echoing through the house. We didn't stop until we were outside, gasping for breath on the front lawn. The house loomed behind us, its dark windows like hollow eyes watching our every move. "What the hell was that?" Kevin panted, his face pale. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice shaking. "But we're not going back in there." The next morning, after a sleepless night at a nearby motel, I decided to dig deeper into the house's history. Kevin wanted nothing to do with it. "You're on your own," he said, his hands trembling as he sipped his coffee. "I've seen enough." I couldn't blame him. Part of me wanted to walk away too, but I knew I wouldn't be able to live with myself if I didn't figure out what was happening. At the local library, I found old newspaper clippings and records about the house. What I discovered made my stomach turn. The man Kevin had mentioned, Samuel, wasn't just a recluse. He was a known occultist who had been obsessed with opening a gateway to another realm. Neighbors had reported strange rituals, animal sacrifices, and unexplained phenomena around the property. But the most chilling part was what happened the night he died. Witnesses claimed to have seen lights flickering in the house and heard unearthly screams. When the authorities arrived, they found Samuel's body twisted and mangled, his face frozen in an expression of pure terror. The room behind the door had been sealed immediately after, and the house changed hands several times over the years. Each owner reported strange occurrences, scratching, whispers, shadows moving in the dark. None of them stayed for long. Armed with this knowledge, I decided to confront whatever was in that room. It wasn't bravery that drove me, it was desperation. I couldn't let the entity, or whatever it was, linger any longer. I returned to the house that evening, carrying a bag of supplies, candles, salt, a crucifix, and a book on banishing rituals that I had found at the library. My hands shook as I unlocked the front door and stepped inside. The house felt different, even more oppressive than before. The air was heavy, and the faint smell of decay lingered. I made my way down the hallway, stopping in front of the door. It looked ordinary, but I knew better. I drew a circle of salt around myself and placed the candles at the cardinal points, just as the book instructed. With the crucifix in one hand and the book in the other, I began to chant the incantation. At first, nothing happened. The house was silent, save for the sound of my own voice. Then, the temperature dropped, and the whispers began. They were louder this time, more insistent. The door rattled, and the lights flickered. I kept chanting, my voice shaking but steady. The whispers turned into screams, horrible, gut-wrenching screams that made my ears ring. The door burst open again, and the figure emerged, more defiant than before. Its twisted form seemed to writhe as it stepped into the candlelight. Its face was a grotesque mask of shadows, and its empty sockets bore into me. I held up the crucifix and shouted the final words of the incantation. For a moment, nothing happened. The figure stood there, motionless. Then it let out a bone-chilling scream and lunged at me. The candles flickered wildly, and the salt circle glowed faintly. The entity hit an invisible barrier and recoiled, shrieking in rage. I kept chanting, my voice growing louder as I repeated the incantation. The figure began to dissolve, its form breaking apart into wisps of shadow. It let out one final, ear-piercing scream before vanishing completely. The door slammed shut, and the house fell silent. I don't remember how long I sat there, shaking and crying. Eventually, I gathered my things and left the house, never looking back. I sold the property soon after, but I made sure to warn the new owners about the door. Whether they heeded my warning, I don't know. I've never been back, and I don't plan to. Even now, years later, I still have nightmares about that night. The whispers, the figure, the door, it all lingers in the back of my mind. I've come to accept that some doors are meant to stay closed, no matter how curious we are. But sometimes, late at night, I think I hear it, the faint sound of scratching, as if something is still trying to get out. Months had passed since my harrowing escape from the cursed house. Yet, I couldn't shake the lingering unease that followed me everywhere. Sleep became an elusive stranger, every creak in my home felt like an echo of the whispers that had surrounded the door. But it wasn't just my imagination. Something had followed me. The signs were subtle at first, misplaced items, faint scratching sounds in the walls, and the sense of being watched. Then came the more alarming phenomena. One night, my bathroom mirror cracked from the inside without explanation. Shadows that didn't belong began to flicker in my peripheral vision, and worst of all, I started hearing the whispers again. I reached out to Professor Malcolm, the occult expert who had helped me decipher the runes. When I explained what had been happening, his face grew pale. The door. It's not just a portal, he said gravely. It's a tether. By opening it, you may have released something, and it's not finished with you. What do? I asked, desperation thick in my voice. You'll have to go back. You need to sever the connection. Destroy whatever is still anchoring it to you. The thought of returning to that house sent chills through me, but I knew there was no other choice. Armed with the professor's advice and a bundle of protective talismans, I returned to the house under the cover of darkness. It felt alive in a way it hadn't before, as if the house itself knew I was there. The air inside was suffocating, heavy with a foul odor I couldn't identify. The whispers began almost immediately, more insistent and sinister than before. They grew louder as I approached the door. My hand trembled as I reached for it. This time, the door didn't resist. It swung open as if welcoming me, revealing the same black void. But now, the void seemed to pulse, alive with malevolent energy. Professor Malcolm's instructions echoed in my mind, you have to go through. Confront it directly. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but I stepped forward. The moment I crossed the threshold, the air changed. I was in a vast, dark expanse with no discernible walls or floor. The only light came from faint, glowing orbs floating in the distance. The whispers became a cacophony, voices screaming over one another in an unintelligible language. Then I saw it. A towering figure emerged from the darkness, its form shifting and twisting as though it were made of shadows. Its eyes glowed an unnatural red, and its presence radiated pure malice. You dare to open the door, it hissed, its voice like nails on a chalkboard. You belong to me now. I clutched the talisman tightly and began chanting the incantation Malcolm had given me. The creature recoiled, its form flickering as though it were struggling to maintain its shape. You think that will stop me? It roared, its voice shaking the void. I am eternal. I cannot be banished. But I didn't stop. The incantation grew louder, my voice gaining strength as I felt the talisman grow warm in my hand. The light from the orbs intensified, and the darkness began to retreat. The creature let out an ear-piercing scream as its form dissolved into the void. The whispers ceased, and the oppressive atmosphere lifted. I stumbled back through the door, collapsing onto the floor of the house. The door slammed shut behind me, and the runes on its surface began to glow before fading into nothingness. The house was silent, eerily still. As I stepped outside, I felt a weight lift from my shoulders. The connection was broken. Whatever had haunted the door, and me, was gone. In the days that followed, the strange occurrences in my home stopped. I finally felt a sense of peace, though I would never forget what I had experienced. I never returned to the house again, but I heard rumors that it was demolished shortly after my visit. Professor Malcolm later explained that the entity behind the door had likely been feeding on fear and despair, using the door as a conduit to our world. By confronting it and severing its connection, I had closed the portal for good. But sometimes, late at night, I still hear faint whispers, like a distant echo of the nightmare I survived. And I can't help but wonder, are there other doors out there, waiting to be opened? Thank you for joining me on this terrifying journey. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like, comment, and share. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling tales of the paranormal.